Executive Director here at ShelterBox Canada. I'm also a fellow Rotarian with Toronto Twilight Club here in District 7070. So get started. We'll go down the list. If you could just introduce yourself so that we can see your fantastic face on the screen. Maybe just give how long you've been in SRT and which Rotary Club you're with. Dave, do you want to start?
Sure. So as it says, I'm with the Rotary Club of Kingston Waterfront. So we are a 5:30 in the evening club on Monday afternoons. And we've been meeting via Zoom for the last, I don't know, 6 weeks or something like that. So I've been an SRT since April 2007, and I've been out on deployment 9 times to 4 continents. So
fantastic. Thank you. Pierre?
Unmute myself here. Pierre Dahlstrom, Rotary Club of Duncan, an SRT since 2009. Been on 10 deployments now, including one with Dave Hallett, which is very memorable. Found out about ShelterBox through my club, Rotary Club of Duncan, in around 2007, and I've been an active member ever since.
Awesome. Thanks, Pierre. Ron?
Thanks, Tess. I'm from the Rotary Club of Kenora, as it indicates. I've been a Rotarian for 24 years. I became an SRT in 2007, and I've had 11 deployments. I still am heavily involved with ShelterBox. I am on the board of ShelterBox Canada, and I was the chair of the board for a period of time. Happy to be here.
Awesome. Thank you guys so much, and we're so excited to have you today. So for the viewers at home, we asked all of our amazing SRTs to send in one of their most memorable or favorite photos from their deployment throughout the year. So Dave, if you want to start us through, we'll just click to the next. Perfect. Dave, do you want to just speak to sort of why you chose this photo, where you are here, and talk a little bit about it?
Well, I love this photo. This was a great photo. So 2010, actually 2009, we went to Malawi to support several communities who suffered through an earthquake. And so we were in the northern end of Malawi. We flew out on the 27th of December 2009, and we got back 2 days before the Haiti earthquake in January of 2010. I love this photo because it shows everybody who was there. So there's me sort of just a little bit left of middle or right of middle, and the 4 guys that were around me closely are the guys who helped for 2 weeks setting up tents, driving around, acting as translators, all that sort of good stuff. The kids are beautiful, as you can see. They are noisy and smiling and great. We got some mothers over there. We've got some village elders kind of looking at us a little, making sure that we're not doing anything wrong. And I just loved the whole camaraderie of this picture.
Awesome. That's great. And I think you can see in the background there the tops of some ShelterBox tents, if I'm correct. Awesome. That's great. Ron, do you want to talk a bit about this photo?
Sure. This photo was taken in Japan after the tsunami of 2011. The reason I chose this photo is I wanted to show the kind of destruction that they were facing in the country. It was really staggering. The tsunami. This is the city of Kesanuma. It's on the northwest coast of Honshu, which is the main island of Japan, where Tokyo is. The tsunami was just offshore, as most people remember, and it drove in just a huge distance. And along these coastal cities, it went in often 2 or 3 kilometers. And if you can try and imagine, behind me this was a thriving city with buildings, houses, huge houses all over, or buildings all over. And this is what we found again and again. It was just absolute total destruction. That one building behind had steel girders, and it managed to barely stay up. But the main reason I chose this was Japan. Most of our deployments are in the third world, as you probably are well aware. Most, third world countries where people are so poor and they're really devastated when they get hit. They can't help themselves very much. Their governments don't do very much. Well, Japan is and that's where we go predominantly. But we do go to first world countries if they're unable to handle it all themselves. And this was a good example. Japan is, as you know, is a wealthy first world country, but they were just overwhelmed. It was so massive that we had to go in, and they needed our help. The other thing about this deployment, it was different in a lot of ways. It was a first world country, but also there was a Fukushima plant. I was on the second deployment team in, and we had to be really careful, obviously, as careful as you can be when you've got a nuclear plant that's, potentially melting down. So what we did differently here too, which again, different from most deployments, we rarely drive ourselves. We rent vehicles and get drivers, and normally in third world countries, they're very inexpensive. But in this country, we decided it wouldn't, we had an escape plan if the plant really went. There was an airport in the north. We were going to head for it and try and get a flight out. But we realized it wouldn't be fair to our drivers if we asked them to drive us north when they had their own families to worry about. So this was a rare situation where we rented vehicles and drove our own vehicles to get ourselves around. And we were able to provide. There was lots of situations where they didn't have enough, and we provided aid for them in the form of tents, particularly. So that's a quick summary of my deployment to Japan.
That's great. Thanks, Ron. I think photos like this are so often just a reminder of what it can be like. And we have some photos like this in the office, and they're always, this one especially is a very striking photo. Thank you for sharing that with us, Ron. And Pierre, if you want to go next, can you talk a little bit about this photo?
Sure, striking contrast. There's to Ron's last photo there. But in a country that was experiencing similar devastation. This was in 2016 in Haiti. It was my second deployment to Haiti in 2010 following the massive earthquake. And I sort of wanted to point out the brighter side of deployments is actually working with the locals. This is one of our drivers, fixers, translators, man of everything. His name was Johnson Alcide, and I don't know, Ron, you might have had the chance to work with him well, and Dave.
I did.
Oh, I think Pierre might be frozen. Wouldn't be a Zoom meeting, a technology moment, I think, without somebody freezing. I'm going to hope that he can come back on, but I'm going to move on to the next question just so we can move back, and hopefully Pierre is able to rejoin us, and then we can circle back to his fantastic photo. So for the first question to Ron and Dave for right now, if you could just kind of quickly talk about how you became involved with ShelterBox, and I just want to encourage as well for everybody tuning in to feel free to ask questions as we move through as well. Ron, do you want to give us a start, just kind of quickly how you actually became involved with ShelterBox? Sure.
I first heard about ShelterBox in 2006. Our club donated some money. The word had come around about ShelterBox and looked interesting. It didn't go any further than that until I went to the Rotary International Convention, which was in Copenhagen in 2007. And ShelterBox had a display. And I said, Claire, my wife, was with me. I said, let's have a look at this. This sounded interesting. And that started it. We talked to them. They were looking for ShelterBox Response Team Members. And we were interviewed right there, put our applications in, and went on from there.
Fantastic. That's great. Dave, how about you?
So I had around the same time, 2006, in that same area. One of the local Rotarians in our neck of the woods, Bill Gray, had brought back a demo shelter box with him from a trip that he made in 2005, and learned about ShelterBox. And he conscripted me to help him set up this demo tent at car shows, craft fairs, golf courses, anywhere we would get permission to set this thing up. And so I would follow Bill around, and we'd set up this ShelterBox tent, and we'd hand out brochures and pamphlets and stuff like that. And then in January of 2007, ShelterBox decided they were going to start looking for their first international response team members. And they sent an email out, I think first in the US, and somehow that sort of made its way to me, the email chain. So I emailed them and I said, would you take a Canadian? And they said, that's close enough to an American, we'll take one. And if any of you know Jim Miller, you can understand his sense of humor. And so I went in April, and I was in the first group of response team members that ever took the 9-day training. And I was in the field in the fall of 2007 for my first deployment.
Awesome. That's great. Really since the beginning. Thanks, Dave. We've got Pierre back on the line, which is great. So I'm just going to skip back to his photo so you can finish explaining this fantastic photo. And then Pierre, I'll ask you the same question of how you got involved with ShelterBox.
Sure. Yeah. Hopefully I don't drop out this time, but basically I just wanted to emphasize that without the partners, amazing partners that we do have in the countries where we operate, we really couldn't get anything done. So this is Johnson, a picture of Johnson and I in 2016 after Hurricane Matthew, and a really busy and productive 2 weeks working in southern Haiti, where 80% of the country had been devastated by that hurricane. And we are celebrating American Thanksgiving in Haiti with a group of Haitian Americans, Canadians, Brits to have sort of one last get together before we exited the country there. I think there was one more team that came in behind us. Quite often when we're on deployment, and if they're a larger response, we will have overlapping deployments and a series of SRTs who come in and sort of pass the reins on to the next group coming in, but the locals who are working will have to often not have a break.
Oh dear, we almost made it.
Almost.
Hopefully, I think he just dropped right off. So we'll, or Pierre, if you're able to just turn off your camera, that might help. Oh,
the good that they've done.
Oh, okay. Pierre, we missed parts of that. I wonder if it's best maybe to turn off your camera, because I think your internet connection might be a little bit spotty, but we know you're there.
Yeah.
But that's fantastic. And I think a great story, as you mentioned, especially of the fact that really these families and leaders in the community are there even after we've left. And I think this is such a fantastic photo. Are you able to just tell us quickly kind of a little bit about how you got involved with ShelterBox?
Well, I found out about it through my Rotary Club on Vancouver Island, and we did a little bit of fundraising for them. I don't think I'd even seen a tent up close and personal until about 2008, and then realized through my search and rescue background that this was something that really appealed to me, and I thought might be something that I could lend a hand in. So I went through the application process and got to the point where, actually, I think Dave, you were one of my shadows in Florida in 2009 there. That would have been the late spring, early summer 2009. Somehow Dave managed to get me through that, and was probably on the second or third set of applicants through the 9-day, and haven't looked back since. It's a wonderful organization. I can't say how much I've enjoyed being part of it, and and the personal challenges and all the self-awareness that comes with really diving deep into an organization like this.
That's fantastic. Thanks, Pierre. So our next question is, how did your first ShelterBox deployment compare to your last deployment that you served, and how has the deployment process possibly changed over time? Ron, do you want to start off?
Sure. My first deployment in 2007 was to Bangladesh, where there was severe flooding. And my last deployment was Fiji. A cyclone had hammered through some of the islands in Fiji. In terms of how it's changed, we've become more refined and more sophisticated. We've obviously learned over time. ShelterBox is a relatively new, relatively young charity, started in 2000. Initially, we would basically just send in supplies and send in some SRTs to send in boxes and send in SRTs to determine where they should go and who needed them most. Now we often send in an assessment team initially, unless it's very obvious. If it's a big disaster, we start sending boxes and other supplies very quickly. But we often send an assessment now to find out exactly what is needed. We do, and we've certainly varied what we supply. Initially, it was shelter boxes, pretty standard, although we did modify a little bit what was in them. We now have a shelter kit, which a tent can be made out of, or a shelter, I should say. You can repair a home. And then we also have sometimes just send specific items, exactly what is needed. We've also, what has changed over time is we do monitoring and evaluation, which is sending in a team after the disaster and everything is settled down, and we go around and interview people that have been given our supplies and talk to locals and governments and leaders and find out what worked and what didn't work, so we can refine exactly what we need. So I think the biggest thing I would say over time is that we've become more specialized and very careful and very specific, so that we are giving people just exactly what they need.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And I think, yeah, it's so interesting to see how we've evolved over those years. And as SRTs, I imagine you just get that firsthand knowledge of how that is. Dave, do you have anything else to add, or can you speak to this experience, how your deployments might have changed from first to last?
Well, my first deployment was to Somaliland, and that was not so much a natural disaster as a human disaster. It was after a civil war in Somaliland, and we were there trying to deliver IDP relief, so internal displaced persons, bring some supplies and stuff in for them. For me, it was very eye-opening. It might be one of the poorest countries on earth. I'd never actually experienced that kind of poverty and that kind of desperation before. I guess the unique thing about that adventure was that after spending 2 weeks of filling out customs forms and working with local leaders to arrange who's going to get the gear and all that sort of stuff, our little team of 3 actually had to leave 2 days before the kit arrived. And there wasn't a follow-on team for us, so we were relying on actually a Canadian from Toronto who was in Hargeisa to sort of pick up our pieces and make sure it gets distributed to who it was supposed to. So that was one of those ones where we did 2 weeks of waiting for kit and it never arrived for us. As opposed to when my last deployment was Indonesia in 2018, where we had pre-positioned stock in Indonesia. And when we arrived, we got gear within days of that earthquake happening in Indonesia. They had 3 earthquakes in a row, like three days in a row, 3 earthquakes in a row. Lots and lots of damage over the north part of an island. And it was only a one-day journey from Jakarta, which was where the warehouse was, that was holding the pre-positioned stock. They put them on trucks, and we had this cadence of going, of a truck leaving Jakarta, taking a day and a half-ish to get to us unloading it, then us spending the next day and a half or two distributing that gear while another truck was coming down. So it was kind of, as opposed to my very first deployment, which was really kind of choppy, my last deployment was like getting gear out on a regular basis in a really quick fashion. So so yeah, two totally different experiences, and in between those two, there was everything in between those two. So
yeah, I can imagine. Yeah, it sounds like every SRT that I talk to, or staff who deploy, every deployment is so incredibly different, and there's so many learnings that happen kind of along the way. Pierre, do you have anything else to add, or experiences that you've had?
Yeah, I'd echo the sentiments there. Both of them. Every deployment's different. We've become more nuanced as an organization. We are much more sort of customer focused as far as delivering a product that suits the customer. We do these monitoring and deployment, monitoring and evaluation deployments, and really try and adapt our aid to the need of the community. So we've become much more consultative, and as a result, more successful as an organization. The first deployment I was on in Sumatra, we had essentially ShelterBox, a one-size-fits-all solution, and we're very successful with our deployment there. But going into my last deployment in Dominica, we were actually able to use equipment like shelter kits to do repairs, or buy and source local.
We almost made it through a full question of Pierre, but hopefully he'll come back. I think his internet just dips out here and there. But while we're waiting, there we go. Sorry, Pierre, you dipped out for a second.
Yeah. Okay.
I think we got most of it though, and yeah, it seems like a similar sentiment in terms of sort of that evolution, especially on our aid front. I wanted to dip in. We have one question from a viewer, so I just wanted to ask. Gil-Marie asked a fantastic question. So to all panelists, she said, can you tell me more about sort of post-deployment activity that ShelterBox engages in? How long a process might be involved in that? So sort of how long are we still working with communities, and what the sort of post-deployment might look like? Dave, do you want to start us off?
Sure. So I think Pierre and Ron mentioned, the evolution of ShelterBox, and I'm going to call it our level of professionalism as an NGO has steadily grown over the 12 or 13 years that I've been there. The early days, we would go out, we would drop some tents off, we'd show some people how to set them up, and then we'd fly home. And that was often the end of our deployment. Now, Ron mentioned assessment teams that go out, because they have to go out and make sure that when we actually do arrive in a community, we arrive with the right gear. We're doing the right thing for the community. We're not creating any new risks in the community. So we do that assessment part of it. And then when the response team members are there actually distributing whatever is determined to be the appropriate aid for that event, after that, we have what we call post-deployment monitoring. And so a team usually with an SRT who is on the ground, as well as maybe an operations coordinator or somebody else from head office, will go back into the field, and they'll go back and they'll look and say, are the tents still being used? And then they'll interview people and say, you know, did anybody have any risks because of the gear they were given? They would go through a whole bunch of those kinds of questions, and try to ensure that what we had hoped to do when the assessment team was there in the first place, what we did do when the SRTs were on the ground doing whatever they were asked to do, actually turned into a result that made the community more prepared and resilient against the next possible disaster. That's a long answer, sorry, but it's a lot work.
No, that's great. And I think one example, just as you were starting to talk, that we've been talking about a lot with our operations team right now is sort of what that looks like in a COVID-19 crisis situation. And so some of you may have read in the April Rotarian magazine, there was a really fantastic article following one of our American SRTs in Paraguay, kind of working with a local Rotaract club there and working with the local community to provide support after flooding. And what we're doing now, sort of as a way to pivot a little bit in response to this crisis, is actually looking back at some of those communities in Paraguay that we worked with earlier in the year to see, are these communities well set up if the virus were to spread in those areas? Do they have what they need to be able to kind of weather this crisis after already having such a natural disaster crisis of their own already? So it's always changing too. I think that's a great example of that, of how we're looking to assess after the fact. Ron, do you have anything to sort of add to that? I know you've done a few sort of post-deployment monitoring trips.
Yeah, I think the main thing I would add is that early on, to ShelterBox credit, we've always, right from the start, we've always had to write reports when we came back from our deployment. Initially, it was all SRTs, and then it became the team lead that did it in coordination with the team. And a part of, these were fairly detailed reports that explained what we did and so on. But we were also required at that point to say, what did you see that was working? What did you think what was not working? And to ShelterBox credit, I always appreciated that, because we were learning, right from the start, what was working and what wasn't working. It became more sophisticated, as I think we all mentioned, where we are now sending post monitoring and evaluation teams that go in and get an idea 6 months or so later to see how everything went. But that's always been a big part, and I think that's a strength in ShelterBox. We're continually learning what works and what doesn't work, and in line with that, we've changed our equipment quite significantly, our aid over the years.
Yeah, absolutely. That's great. And I'm just going to skip to the next question just for time and get Pierre to start us off. So for the next question here is, could you tell what's one story from the field that for you made you feel like sort of all of your hard work paid off? Pierre, do you want to start us off?
Sure. One of the stories I was going to tell in conjunction with the photo that I showed at the beginning there with the turkeys and Jocelyn from Haiti was, the amount of aid that we brought in in 2010 for the earthquake in Haiti that ultimately killed close to 300,000 people was so immense that we still had some storage of that equipment in 2016 when I returned. Some of the tents that we brought in originally, we weren't able to deploy for various reasons. So there was a warehouse that I returned to that we as a team started to use some of the equipment out of it. We might not have been able to use the tents right away, but we certainly got in and used all of the other cooking equipment, sleeping materials, mats, etc. We parsed those out and were able to use them effectively in 2016, years later. So the tents eventually from those shipments were parceled up and sent off and used in another deployment elsewhere. So as far as you know, originally getting there and thinking that we'd abandoned some of this equipment, and then to come back years later and realize, no, it's here right now, and we can use it for this good purpose now. Really, you know, made us feel, you know, like we put good use to this equipment, and we're you know, pushing things forward, turning a bad situation, what was a bad situation, into a good one years later. There's so many sort of coincidental stories that I can talk about, sort of meeting people years later on another deployment that you'd form good relationships with in other deployments, and putting those relationships immediately to good use to try and do good things within that new country and that new situation. It's you know, there's no one story that I can point to, other than to say that all the good work that you do, whether or not you think it's paying off now, will pay off in the future if you're just persistent and continue to do good work with the organizations that you're teaming up with.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Thank you. Ron, can you speak a bit about this? Sort of what, if you have a story, if you can pick just one, but a story that made it feel like all your hard work paid off?
Sure. There's lots of them, as you can imagine. One of the big things, you know, the expression, a hand up, but not a hand, rather than a hand out. Well, that really applies to ShelterBox. So much of what we do is hope. Nobody wants to live in a tent for the rest of their lives, but when they've lost everything, it's wonderful. And we see this again and again, and it just gives them hope and time to start rebuilding their lives and their homes. But in line with that, a quick story. In the Philippines, my wife is an SRT as well, Claire, and we were deployed together. And one of the things we do after we set up camps, we go back and check to see how things are working while we're there. If we have time, we really make a point of trying to do that. And she came upon a tent with a little old lady sitting out in front. And Claire asked her how things were, and she said, fine. She said, were you hit pretty hard? And she'd lost her husband and several children. And she was staying in the tent with extended family members in one of our tents. And we have available in our tent small dividers where you can actually divide one end of the tent off slightly so that one or two people can sleep there and have some privacy. When Claire asked her about the equipment, she said, this little divider is just wonderful. She says, I have a little bit of time to myself. So it was really quite poignant how a small thing like that meant so much to her in a very, very difficult time.
Yeah, thank you. That's fantastic. I'm just going to actually ask Dave the same question. Sorry, I'm not controlling my own slides here, but I'm just going to ask Dave the same question. If you can talk about a time where you felt like all of your hard work really paid off.
Well, yeah, like the rest of the guys said, almost every time you go out, it's a memorable trip. But I do remember going out to the Philippines with Pierre. That's where we were traveling together, and with Anna, and we were part of the Christmas crew because that disaster happened right at the end of November. There was a number of SRT deployed across a number of different islands, and they all went home for Christmas, and a small team of us, probably I think it was maybe 6 or 7, spread out over a few islands. And Anna, Pierre, and I spent time in Bantayan Island, working right up till Christmas Eve, giving people shelter on Christmas Eve, so that they had a place to stay and be warm, and be out of the rain and that sort of stuff. And that was really special. It was also a little bit special because on Christmas Day, we actually got together with many of the other NGOs. You know, we tend to work alone on our own most of the time. But we had some nice experience with some of the other NGO people that were there, some of the nurses and some of the doctors and some of the other technicians that were there. And so that was a special trip. And I'll just leave it at that.
I love that too, because I think sometimes we forget that our SRTs that are our amazing volunteers work all year, that you really set your schedule for those who might not know, they sort of set their schedule in times that they're available to deploy. And many of them do deploy over Christmas or family holidays. And it's, you know, because I think because they love the organization, but it's an incredible volunteer position that we're so grateful to have. And I just want to quickly answer before we skip to the next question. We did get a question in the chat that actually I think I can answer, hopefully, is how many SRTs exist today, and is there an annual target to train and certify new ones? So currently we're sitting around, I think, about 150 response team members training new SRTs every year. Typically that opens up 2 times a year. Obviously right now we're meant to open that up sometime in the spring, and then again in the fall, I believe, but that's been put on hold. But I would suggest if anybody on the call is interested in joining these amazing volunteers, to follow our social media. Is usually the first place that we post it, as well as our email list. All of the SRT training is handled through our incredible team at our headquarters in the UK. But if you do have any really specific questions about it or are interested, get in touch with us and we'll put you on a list to make sure you get the updated info when it becomes available. So the next question here is especially something specific to the audience we've got here, all these incredible fellow Rotarians. What is something that you learned from being an SRT that you brought to the world of Rotary? So something you learned while being a response team member with ShelterBox that you've brought into your life as a Rotarian. Pierre, do you want to start?
Sure. Well, you learn so many things being an SRT and just putting yourself out there in the world. I mean, Rotarian values, I think, are reflected very deeply in the SRT world. I just think of the 4-way test. I was a Rotarian before and I was an SRT, and it seems that building goodwill and better friendships seems to be the key when we're working within the communities, and when we're working with our partners, that seems to give us the most success as an organization. And it's something I think really at the end of the day, it's relationships that matter. And if you can build something positively, and you're embracing the challenge as positively as you can, then you're going to be successful. I suppose that's what I brought is the can-do attitude from the SRT world into the world of Rotary. It's a refreshing sort of mentality.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there's so much crossover. I was with ShelterBox as a staff member before I became a Rotarian, and I find that there's so many things between the two with shared values. So that's great. Ron, do you have anything that you want to add?
Sure. I'd bring it, just sort of turn the question around a little bit, and what I learned in Rotary that I brought to ShelterBox. I was a Rotarian long before I became involved with ShelterBox and an SRT. And I think the motto of Rotary is service above self, and that certainly applies significantly here. It's a challenge on these deployments. You're often doing long hours. You can be in potentially dangerous situations, but you know, there's such a huge need out there, and you see it. We've all alluded to it. It is service above self, and which I love about the Rotary and the Rotary's motto, and also just the straight international aspect of it. Rotary has clubs in the range of 200 countries in the world, and we work internationally. It's a very big part of Rotary. Rotary does a lot in their own countries, and in their own communities, of course. That's also a big part. But the international aspect is also very big, and the two fit well together in that sense.
Yeah, definitely. And for those of you, I'm sure most know on the call, but we are Rotary International's project partner and working with Rotary so often, not as only as having Rotarians as staff and SRTs, but yeah, absolutely, sort of in all deployments. And yeah, that's great.
If I could just quickly add,
Yeah.
Tess, it's not specifically this question, but Rotary is huge to ShelterBox. We most often, our first contact in the countries we're going into are Rotarians. They provide so much help for us, and we work with them continually when we're in the countries. It would be very difficult to do without the great support that we receive from Rotarians International.
Yeah, absolutely. Definitely. Dave, do you have anything that you want to add on there of sort of what yeah, both ways, I think, learned from Rotary brought to ShelterBox or ShelterBox brought to Rotary?
I guess here's Pepper. Just what's playing on what Ron just said, you know, I've had a number of examples where Rotarians around the world have helped me. You know, when we went in 2011 into East Africa because of famine, I was part of the first team that arrived in Addis Ababa in Ethiopia, and we've never worked in that country before. And we had no local contacts or anything like that. And I think the second day we were there, we showed up at a Rotary luncheon, Rotary meeting at a hotel in downtown Addis Ababa, and afterwards, you know, introduced ourselves or during the meeting, introduced ourselves. And afterwards, 2 past district governors came over to us and said, hey, good to hear you're here. How can we help? And so we laid out the challenges we had. We needed UN introductions. We needed trucks. We needed this. We needed that. And these guys said, okay, we'll help with that. And so we ended up with trucks and drivers and translators and all kinds of good stuff. And you know, a similar thing when I was in Nepal, we were having trouble getting stuff off the tarmac as things were going into Kathmandu after the earthquake in Nepal, and we got a hold of a couple of Rotarians, and they basically cleared the way for us, and so we got stuff through. So those kinds of stories happen all the time, and almost everybody's got one of those to share. The interesting part about it is I bring that back though to my club when I'm talking to them, and to the clubs when I go and make talks and stuff, because we all hear about people who are coming from around the world to our neighborhoods for doing different things, right? Whether they're riding, I don't know, bike-a-thons around lakes or doing whatever it is they're doing. And I try to encourage the Rotarians that I participate with to get out there and meet them and do things. And so, you know, I've encouraged people to go on friendship exchanges, and we've hosted Rotarians in our homes as they've come to visit for one reason or another, and those sorts of things. So I try to bring that help that we've received back to our local clubs, and encourage our local Rotarians to just get involved as much as they can in those things that come to us.
Yeah, fantastic. I think, yeah, I've been doing sort of one of the benefits, I think, of this situation is so many clubs are meeting virtually right now. And so Allison and myself, we've been doing Rotary presentations really from coast to coast. It feels like at all hours of day. But what's been incredible is that you've heard so many amazing stories like that of Rotarians really embracing their local community during this time, still giving to ShelterBox, still supporting their international initiatives. And I think there's so many amazing things like that and examples like that. So thank you so much for sharing. We're coming up on short time, so I've just asked the next question if you're able to just keep the answers a bit brief, and then we'll wrap it up. And if there are any other questions that come in from those of you watching, happy to sort of squeeze those in or send them through to the email that's being shared in the chat, and we'll try our best to get answers for you after the call. But Ron, if you want to start us off with the question of, can you share a time when you felt up against a wall working either with local government or leaders, and have you had to have really difficult conversations with any leaders, or how you sort of overcame some of those challenges?
Sure, I have indeed. In the Philippines, as we were going around doing our pre-deployment assessment, we had lots of boxes, and we knew there was we'd been to the Philippines incidentally more times than any other country in the world, and it's more than once a year on average. But this one mayor in this one community said, yeah, you know, we sure need some boxes. There's people that need them. So we said, okay, can you give us some specifics and who they are and the situation? He says, no, you just give me the boxes. I'll look after distributing them. Well, we just didn't give them the boxes because we have run into that sort of thing at times where people are looking for them on their own, and they are worth a lot in these third world countries. So we did not deploy there. But the other one that was interesting was actually in our country, related to the Indian consulate in Toronto. I was called quite a few years ago to go to India on an assessment, myself and another SRT from the UK. And we had to get moving quickly, as we do for assessments right after there was some bad flooding. And Rotarians had called for our help. So I had to you have to get a visa to get into India from Canada. So I booked a flight immediately, flew into Toronto really early in the morning, and my flight that evening was late out of Toronto to India. And so I thought this will give me lots of time to get a visa, because I had phoned the office and they said, sure, you can get visas in one day quite easily. I went in and they sent me in to see the deputy consul general, and he was very welcoming. I told him what we were doing and he just stiffened in his chair. He says, you're talking about bringing aid to India? India doesn't need aid. And I spent almost a week in Toronto. They needed the aid. We had Rotarians on the ground that were dealing, Indian Rotarians that were asking for the aid. I contacted our consul, in India, and talked to all sorts of people, and we were just being stonewalled. So I finally the UK did not require visas. So I finally said to the UK, you better get a second SRT from the UK, and away you go. So that's what ended up happening. So that's my story.
Wow. Yeah, that's definitely a wall to work up against, for sure. Dave, do you have a sort of quick story as we wrap up?
Well, there's lots of them, but I'll and one with a good ending. Ron and I went to China together in 2008 after the earthquake in China, and we were the last team in. So we might have been team number 5 or something like that. And when we arrived, all of the ShelterBox tents that ShelterBox had in their headquarters had all been distributed. They had actually bought some just general Van Gogh tents, and they had all been distributed. And so the people in headquarters made an arrangement with the actual factory, I think it's in Shanghai, that made our tents at that time, to ship them directly to us. And so the fun part about that was actually finding them, if you recall, Ron. There were 3 main train stations in Chengdu, in the Sichuan province, and we visited all 3 of those for several days in a row, because everybody said it's at the main cargo train station, and we went there 2 and 3 times a day, and our translators were trying to figure out where these things were. And then finally, I guess some Chinese guy overheard us asking about these things. Where's all this cargo coming into? And he said to our translator, he said, well, there's a special train station that's been set up just for this disaster. And it was in the middle of some industrial park or something. And so here we are, the 4 of us and our 2 translators. We climb in the back of this seatless van, no seats in the van, and this guy's driving us out into some industrial park that we had really no idea where we were going. Those are back in the days before we wrote out transit reports before we left. But so we had this struggle to find this mysterious 4th railway station that took us days and days and days. And then finally we found it, and I think we all took our pictures in front of the tents of that day. We were so excited to see them. So a little bit of struggle, because local leaders, they knew what they were doing, but we didn't know what they were doing. And finally we found the tents and we got them out. So anyway, there's another whole great story after that, but we'll leave that one for another day.
That's a good happy ending. Yeah. Absolutely. Pierre, how about you to wrap us up?
Yeah, sure. I mean, there's, as Dave said, there's so many stories that you can draw on. Part of our challenge, a big part of our challenge coming into any disaster country, is to try and logistically get our equipment in country. It can be sitting on the tarmac, 100 meters away from where you are, but frustratingly, if you don't have those good relations, or the right paperwork in the right order, with your consignees, with everyone else in the sort of brokerage chain to get your goods in country, you can have a long wait ahead of you. So the story I wanted to sort of end with was is sort of a risk attenuation story, the boiling frog syndrome, where you can be coming into a situation with fresh eyes, like we were in Haiti in 2016, and be partnered up with somebody that's been in the country for many more weeks than you have, and completely have another perspective on the security situation. So the news that we were getting coming in to Haiti was that we really had to be careful of the convoys and the trucking systems that were being hijacked along the roadside. So we had to have some very difficult conversations with some of the in-country trucking providers to actually provide alternatives so that we diminished that risk and didn't expose ourselves to losing either our goods or putting our personnel at risk. So those can be very difficult situations if you are new to a situation, relatively new to a situation, and are dealing with the people who have been doing it that way for weeks, just because that was the way that they had become accustomed to, sliding down that slippery slope of approaching a calamitous situation. So.
Yeah, I've never heard a story like that. That's so interesting. And I imagine as SRTs, you have to be a very good problem solver and quick on your feet. So yeah, I can imagine that would be incredibly challenging. And then if you add in the added bits around, if you don't speak the same language, I imagine that can add an extra challenge for sure. So I just want to say thank you so much to everybody who has joined us today for the time of our incredible response team members, Ron, Dave, and Pierre. And if you have any questions that came out that we weren't able to get to, please get in touch. We'd be more than happy to try our best to get answers set to you. We also are doing lots of virtual presentations as well. So if you would like to schedule a presentation for your Rotary Club to get an update, to hear some stories from the field, or hear about how we're working in response to coronavirus, please get in touch. And thank you so much for all of your continued support and for joining us this early evening or afternoon, depending on where you are. So thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.